The ring wasn't chosen for her. The house wasn't built for her. She had understood this from the first night. Standing in the entryway of Harwick Hall, with her traveling case still in her hand, watching the housekeeper's eyes move past her to check whether anyone more important had arrived behind her. No one had. It was only Cecile Morrow, 23 years old, 5 weeks married, wearing her mother's best dress because her own had been wrong and wrinkled beyond saving. Mr. Aldous Harwick. She was still practicing calling him that in her head, Mr. Harwick, because Aldous felt presumptuous and husband felt like a word borrowed from someone else's life, had stood beside her and said nothing. Not "this is my wife," or "welcome to your home," or even something practical like "Mrs. Hicks will show you to your room." He had simply walked ahead, and she had followed, because that was the arrangement. Her mother had called it a good match, a very good match, in the particular tone she used when she meant don't ask further questions. Aldous Harwick was 34, widowed, owner of a considerable property in Western Virginia, and he had come to their county on some business with the bank that Cecile had never been told the specifics of. He had attended the Patmore dinner, sat across from Cecile, and made an inquiry through her father the following Thursday. Her father had accepted before the week was out. Cecile had been consulted exactly once, briefly, with the door closed. She had said yes. Of course she had said yes. She was the second daughter of a family with shrinking prospects, and a younger sister whose debut was approaching, and a father whose good judgment everyone praised and whose debts nobody mentioned. She was practical. She was sensible. She was, her mother's word, steady, which Cecile had long ago understood meant she was not the pretty one, not the lively one, not the one men talked about after a dinner party. Steady meant useful. Steady meant she would do. She did. The house in October was cold in the mornings before the fires were lit, and Cecile had learned quickly that the fires were not lit before 7, no matter what the temperature was outside, because Mr. Harwick kept a schedule, and Mrs. Hicks kept Mr. Harwick's schedule, and Mrs. Hicks had been at Harwick Hall for 19 years, and did not require adjustment from a woman who had been here for 5 weeks. This was not said outright. It was communicated through the angle of Mrs. Hicks's chin and the particular way she looked at Cecile's requests. Not refusing them, exactly, but receiving them the way one received an opinion from a guest who did not understand how things were done. Cecile had stopped making requests by the 3rd week. She had started instead to observe. She observed that Mr. Harwick rose at 5:30 and spent an hour in his study before breakfast. She observed that he took his coffee black and his toast without butter, and that he read 2 newspapers from front to back while doing so, and that this was not a habit he intended to interrupt for conversation. She observed that he was civil to her, genuinely civil, not cold, not unkind, and that this civility had the quality of something practiced rather than felt, like a man who had learned the correct forms and applied them reliably, without particular interest in the outcome. She observed that there was a portrait in the upstairs hall, near the door to what she had come to think of as the other bedroom, and that the woman in the portrait was dark-haired and vivid-looking, and had been painted with her chin slightly lifted, as if she were about to say something. She had not asked about the portrait. She did not need to. Her name, Cecile had learned from the housemaid Bet, who was 16 and cheerfully indiscreet in the way of people who do not yet understand which information is dangerous, had been Mrs. Helena Harwick. She had died 3 years ago. A fever, Bet said, very sudden. Mr. Harwick had been away on business and had not reached home in time. Cecile looked at the portrait sometimes when she passed it. The woman in it looked like someone who would expect to be there for a very long time. She wrote to her Nell on a Tuesday, which was when the post went out. She wrote the things that were easy to write. The dimensions of the garden, the quality of the light in the afternoons, the fact that there was an excellent lending library in the nearest town, and that she had already been twice. She did not write what she actually thought about, which was whether she had made a mistake, and if so whether the mistake was a thing that could be survived or only accommodated. Nell wrote back 12 days later. Nell's letters were long and slightly breathless, and full of detail about people and events that Cecile was already beginning to feel remote from, the way one feels remote from a dream by afternoon. Mother says you must be very happy, Nell wrote, which told Cecile that their mother had not asked Nell to write and that Nell had not figured this out yet. Are you happy? Nell wrote, a little further down. Then, directly below it, without waiting for the answer. George Prentham asked about you at the Osgood party. I think he was sorry you were gone, George Prentham. Cecile put the letter on the desk and looked at the window for a moment. George Prentham had had kind eyes and had danced with her twice at the Whitfield Assembly, and had then, with perfect consistency, Never done anything about it at all. She had liked him. She was no longer certain what that liking had amounted to, or what she had expected it to become. She folded Nell's letter and put it in the small box she kept in the left drawer of the writing desk. Her own writing desk. One of the few things her mother had insisted she bring. Something that's yours, her mother had said, in a voice that came close to admitting something, and she went downstairs for dinner. Mr. Harwick was already at the table when she came in. He looked up, which he always did, and he stood, which he always did, and he waited until she was seated before sitting himself, which was, she had the kind of courtesy that said nothing about regard and everything about upbringing. "The weather is turning," he said. "It is," she said. He served her before himself. He asked whether the pheasant was to her taste. She said it was. There was a short silence of the particular quality she had come to identify as not uncomfortable exactly, but not comfortable either. And then he mentioned something about the fence on the north pasture requiring attention before the first frost. And she asked a question about it, because she had found that asking questions about the property kept the conversation going to a reasonable length, and she had no desire to perform cheerfulness across an empty table. He answered. He was, she had noticed, genuinely informative when she asked about the property. Not condescending, he did not explain things as if she couldn't follow, which she appreciated. He spoke about the land the way some people spoke about family, with a kind of unsentimental attentiveness that was its own form of feeling. "Did the first Miss Harwick take an interest?" she asked, and then immediately wished she hadn't, not because it was a wrong question, but because the table went quiet in a particular way and she watched something move across his face that she could not fully read. "Helena," he said, "found the country very dull." He said it simply, without cruelty or pity, or any special emphasis. Just a fact, reported. And yet Cecile had the strong impression that it was not the whole story, and that the whole story was the kind of thing he did not tell to people across dinner tables. "I don't find it dull," she said, which was true. He looked at her for a moment, really looked, which was slightly different from his usual way of looking, which was polite and present but not quite seeing. Then he said, "No, I don't suppose you do," and went back to his dinner. She filed that moment somewhere careful. It was in November that she found the letters. Not discovered them, stumbled on them, which was different. She had been helping Bet locate a set of household accounts that Mrs. Hicks believed were in the upper study, and Bet had opened the wrong cabinet, and Cecile had seen them over Bet's shoulder before either of them quite registered what they were. A bundle of letters, tied with a dark ribbon, tucked behind a ledger that had not been moved in some time. Bet closed the cabinet immediately and said she would try the next one. Cecile let her. She said nothing. But she thought about the letters for the rest of the afternoon, not because she wanted to read them. She didn't, or told herself she didn't, but because of the ribbon. It was the kind of ribbon that came from a hat or a dress. Dark green, slightly flattened with age, tied with a bow that someone had been careful about. That bow had not been tied by a man trying to organize household papers. That bow had been tied by someone who thought of it as something worth preserving. She told herself it wasn't her concern. She told herself this 3 times over the following 2 days, which was approximately 2 times too many for something that actually wasn't her concern. The snow came before December. Cecile had not expected that. She had understood intellectually that Western Virginia had real winters, not the gentle gray dampness of the county she'd grown up in. But she had not understood it in the way the body understands things until she woke one morning to the light coming wrong through the curtains, and went to the window and saw it. The whole of Harwick Hill gone white and still. She stood at the window for a long time. She heard Mr. Harwick in the hall outside her door, his steps, which she knew now without having tried to learn them, deliberate and even, and then a pause, and then his knock. Mrs. Harwick," he caught himself. She noticed that. "There'll be no travel today. I wanted you to know." "Thank you," she said through the door. A pause. "The library has some adequate volumes if you haven't exhausted them," he said. "And there's a fire already in the east sitting room, if you prefer that to your own." "Thank you," she said again. And then before she could think better of it, "Would you join me?" The silence on the other side of the door was not a long one. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. "For an hour," he said. "I have correspondence." She dressed and went downstairs and sat in the east sitting room with a book she did not read. And 40 minutes later he came in and sat across from her with what appeared to be correspondence, and also did not appear to read it. They sat for 2 hours. At some point she put down her book and watched the snow. "Do you have family?" she asked. "Besides the property." "A brother," he said. "In Richmond." "We're not close." "Why not?" He looked up from his papers. That's a direct question. I'm a direct person, she said. And then, because she was apparently committed to this now. I've been trying not to be because I thought it made things easier for you, but I think I've been wrong about that. He put his papers down. She looked at the fire. I don't know anything about you, and you don't know anything about me. And we're going to be in this house together for a very long time, presumably. And I think we've been pretending that civility is sufficient, and I don't think it is. For me, she paused. I'm sorry if that's inconvenient. The room was quiet except for the fire. She did not look at him. My brother, Aldous said, did not come to Helena's funeral. He had reasons. I found the reasons inadequate and I told him so, in terms that were not forgivable, and he hasn't forgiven them. Cecile looked at him then. I was, he said carefully, not a reasonable person in that period. You loved her, he said it without inflection, and she was unhappy here, and I knew it, and I believed we would resolve it, that she would come to find it sufficient. I was away very often, managing other properties, and she was alone here more than she should have been, and I told myself it was temporary. He stopped. It wasn't temporary. The snow hit the window with a soft sound, just briefly. I'm sorry, Cecile said, and meant it, and did not add anything to it, because some things didn't want company. He looked at her for a moment in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the practiced civility and not the assessing quiet. Something else, something that had less armor on it. You really don't find it dull, he said. I find it, she considered. I find it demanding. The silence is demanding. The size of it is demanding. But that's different from dull. She looked at the window. I grew up in a house where there was always someone talking and no one ever said anything. I'm learning what I actually think because there's room for it. He was quiet for a moment, then. What do you think, right now? Yes. Right now I think, she said, that I'm glad there's a fire, and that I'm slightly worried about the north pasture fence, and that you are considerably less unkind than I initially believed, and that I would like, if possible, to be something other than a civil arrangement to you. She paused. And that was an extraordinary thing to say, and I apologize. Don't, he said. He said it quietly, but he meant it. She found this out not from reading them. She never read them, but from Aldous himself in February, when the snow had turned to mud and the north pasture fence had been repaired, and they had developed the habit of an evening hour by the fire that had started with the blizzard and quietly persisted. They were hers, he said, answering a question she hadn't asked, but that had apparently been visible anyway. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the fire. She kept letters from her family in Georgia. She was homesick for a very long time. You kept them. I couldn't, he stopped, started again. It seemed wrong to destroy them. They were hers. Did you ever think about sending them to her family? Her mother died the year after. I didn't. There was no one left who would have wanted them in the same way. He was quiet for a moment. I should have done more. While she was alive, I keep returning to that. Cecil set down her book. You can't resolve that, she said. That particular regret, it isn't solvable. You can only carry it differently, maybe. Eventually, he turned to look at her. It was a look that she had learned to recognize by now, the one where he was actually thinking about what she'd said, rather than formulating a response. How do you know that? He said. My father, she said. He has the same quality of regret, about my mother. He was always going to do something, and then he didn't, and now he still hasn't. And I think he's decided to feel guilty about it instead of just doing the thing, because guilt requires less of him. That's a hard view of your father. It's an accurate one. She paused. I love him very much. That's separate. Aldous looked at her for another moment. Then something happened to the line of his shoulders. A small thing. A loosening. I should have taken her to Georgia, he said. I told myself we would go in the spring. 3 springs went by. Yes, Cecile said simply. Not you should have. Not it's all right. Just the acknowledgement of it. He was quiet. Then, you're very uncomfortable to talk to. I know. I mean that as a... I'm not certain what I mean it as. I think, Cecile said. You mean it as a compliment. I think I do, he said. The letter from Nell arrived in March, with a particular kind of news packed into cheerful language. The kind of thing that required Cecile to read it twice, to find the actual information beneath the softening. Their father had made an investment. It had not performed as expected. There were, Nell's phrase, some adjustments being made, which meant, Cecile understood with the part of herself that had grown up watching her parents not discuss finances over dinner, that things were considerably worse than some adjustments. She sat with the letter for a long while. Then she went to find Aldous. He was in the library, going over accounts with a man from town whom Cecile had met twice and whose name she always had to recall deliberately. Mr. Fisk, yes. She waited in the doorway until the conversation reached a natural pause and Aldous looked up. "When you have a moment," she said. He came to her study 20 minutes later. He sat across from her desk without being asked, which was new. She handed him the letter without preface. He read it. She watched his face, which gave very little while he was reading. It was only afterward, when he set the letter down, that she saw the thing she'd been looking for, not pity, not the calculation of someone thinking about what this now cost him. Something more careful than that. "Your sister," he said. "Is she?" "She's fine. They're not. It isn't catastrophic. Not yet." Cecile kept her voice level. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you because I decided in November that I was going to actually tell you things, and so I'm telling you this." He was quiet for a moment. "What would help them?" "Aldous, not charity," he said. "I'm not suggesting that. But if your father is in need of advice from someone not connected to his current situation, he doesn't like to be advised." "Neither do I," Aldous said. "In my experience, that's rarely the determining factor." She looked at him. He was not smiling exactly. His face didn't do that easily, but there was something in it that was close. "I'll write to him," she said. "And if he's willing to speak to someone, I'll let you know." "Good." He started to stand. "Aldous," she said it without thinking about it, just the name, his first name, which she had never used directly to his face. He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for not making this into something smaller than it is, or something larger." He looked at her for a moment. That same look, the one she'd started to rely on without admitting to herself that she was relying on it. "You have a tendency," he said, "to thank me for things I ought to do simply as a matter of course." "You have a tendency," she said, "to do things simply as a matter of course without appearing to expect notice for them. I think someone should notice." He left. She listened to his steps go down the hall. She turned back to her desk and sat looking at Nell's letter for another minute, and then she put it in the box with the others. Not Helena's letters. Her box, the one her mother had said was hers, and she thought, in a quiet and not entirely composed way, that she was beginning to understand something she had not expected to understand this year. Spring came. The garden, which had been a gray and indeterminate thing under the snow, turned out to have roses. Well established. Growing along the south wall, in a manner that suggested someone had planted them, long ago, with the intention of staying. Cecile spent a morning out there with gardening gloves and the groundskeeper's assistant, a boy of about 14, who had very strong opinions about which canes needed cutting. She came in with mud on her hem, and a scratch on her left wrist from a rose that had objected to her, and Aldous was in the entryway. He looked at the mud, he looked at the scratch. He said nothing, but he went to the small table by the door and came back with a handkerchief, his own, pressed and clean and completely unsuitable for garden scratches, and held it out. She took it. She pressed it to her wrist. She looked at the roses, she said. Were they Helena's? They were here when she arrived, he said. She liked them in the window, but she found gardening. Cecile said. Dull, he confirmed. And this time there was something in his voice when he said it. Not the careful flatness of January, not the guarded silence of the autumn. Something that acknowledged, without quite naming, that dull was the distance between Helena and this house, and that the distance had never been bridged, and that the woman currently standing in his entryway with mud on her hem and his handkerchief pressed to her wrist was not, in fact, dull. I'll replant the south bed, Cecile said, if that's all right. I have ideas about what it could be. It's your house, he said. She had heard these words before. Her mother, the housekeeper, even Nell in letters, but not like this. Not as if the speaker actually meant the full weight of the word your. She looked at him. Is it? She said. He looked back at her. He seemed for a moment to be working out how to say something accurately. Something he had not said before, and wanted to say correctly the first time. I told myself when we married, he said, that I was doing a practical thing, that I required a household managed and a certain kind of continuity, and that the arrangement was mutual and appropriate and sufficient. And, she said, and I believe, he said carefully, that I was wrong about what sufficient meant, and that you have been, that the past months have been, rather more than I had prepared myself for. In a good way, she asked. She meant for the question to be light. It came out a little less light than that. In the most inconvenient way imaginable, he said. And this time there was something unmistakable in his face. Something that was, in its guarded and deliberate way, as close as Aldous Harwick came to naked. She laughed. It surprised her. It surprised him. It was a short, real laugh, the kind that came up before she could decide to have it, and his face changed in response, in the particular way that faces change when they've been waiting for permission to change. The south bed, she said. We'll need additional soil, and I want Sweet William along the edge. And I'll need a second pair of gloves because clearly mine are insufficient. I'll have Bet order them, he said, and I would like, she said, to have Nell come to visit in June. If that's agreeable. It's agreeable, and I would like you to stop calling me Mrs. Harwick in that tone you use when you're being formal. He considered this. What tone should I use? Any other one, she said. The morning light came through the entryway window and laid itself across the floor between them and Cecile Morrow. Cecile Harwick, she thought, and for the first time that was not a borrowed word, stood in her house, in the mud, holding his handkerchief against her wrist, and felt, for the first time since October, entirely like herself. The ring had not been chosen for her, but she thought, looking at him, that the man wearing its match might be, slowly, learning to be.